Good evening, El Paso. Welcome to Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera, where we share the fun of the big questions with you. My name is Dr. Kim Diaz, and I teach philosophy at EPCC.
And my name is Jules Simon, and I'm a philosopher at the University of Texas, El Paso.
And today we have the honor of having Dr. Paul Shockley, who is a first-generation student, and he received his Ph.D. in philosophy from Texas A&M University, affectionately known as Dr. Shock. Paul specializes in aesthetics, the history of philosophy, ethics, and religious studies. Paul received his BA in history at Th.M. Austin State University, a master's in theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, an MA in Humanities in the history of ideas at the University of Texas, Dallas. Using a multidisciplinary approach, he studies the transactional experiences between theology, the arts, religious contexts, and sociological constructions therein. He is a lecturer of philosophy and ethics at Th.M. Austin State University, and last year Paul was awarded SFA's University Teaching Excellence Award by the Faculty Senate. He is also a lecturer in religious studies at the University of Miami, where he teaches courses such as Religion and Evil. His published books include Evangelical America, an encyclopedia of contemporary religious culture, Worship as Experience, an inquiry into John Dewey's aesthetics, the community, and the local church, and Thinking with Excellence, navigating the college experience and beyond. Paul has lectured in places like Ghana, Indonesia, Liberia, and Scotland, and he frequently leads varied tours to Israel and Jordan, exploring the archaeological, cultural, geographical, historical, and religious sites. Paul is an avid student with a wide array of interests, including art history, beekeeping, flash fiction literature, gardening, restoring Victorian homes, sociological theory, and all things related to C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And he's a Trekkie too.
Live long and prosper.
So good to have you, Paul.
It's such an honor to be here. Thank you so very much for having me.
Given your background and training and relatively lifelong interests, maybe you could, this season where we've been looking at borders between different disciplines. And one of those borders is philosophy and religion. So sometimes people think that religion has nothing to do with philosophy and philosophy nothing to do with religion, but we want to explore that border, and so with you and others, so we would like to find out what your ideas are on what's religion. Why is it important to be religious or practice a religion?
Or to study it.
Or to study religion, right?
Excellent questions. So 85% of the world's population is affiliated with some world religion. So that's 85%. So just in terms of demographics alone, it is worth knowing what people, what they embrace, what they believe, what's their worldview, how they live their lives. And even here in El Paso, here in El Paso, you have about 49% of the people right here in El Paso who are Catholic. And then other than the second demographic, which is made up of other Christians, the third largest demographic right here in El Paso is Pentecostal. Isn't that interesting? 1.5%. So taken as a whole, whether we're speaking of El Paso area or around the world, in order to understand people, who they are, where they're coming from, what they believe, why they behave the way that they do, knowing religion is incredibly important. Now, when we come to trying to define what religion is, literally, it is what to bind, to yoke together. And if you ask somebody on the street, well, what does religion mean? They'll probably say, well, it's a belief in God, especially here in this area, in this context, a belief in God or a belief in gods. And some people will say, well, it just means you go to church. So in our context, religion is identified with belief in God or going to a church, etc. But and I totally get that. But when you start trying to define what religion is, well, that you just enter into a very nebulous and muddy terrain. And so, people will say, well, religion is one that seeks to make existence meaningful by offering an ideological, offering practical, an aesthetic, and even a symbolic system. But is that an adequate definition of what religion is, right? Because one does not have to be religious in order to embrace those things, to embrace a system like that. And somebody might say, well, religion is that which engenders social cohesion. But once again, one could be very anti-religious, but be part of that type of system. And then of course, Karl Marx, if you were to ask Karl Marx what he would say, right, his statement was, and I think it's been taken out of context, but that religion is opium for the masses. But he said that in view of evil and suffering that people are experiencing, and they're looking for hope. And so they're looking for something to believe in, to have relief and release from all the misery that they're experiencing. And then, of course, there are people like Emily Durkheim, that great sociologist, who said that religion is a system of beliefs and practices that deal with what is material and immaterial, what's held to be sacred. But still, it just doesn't seem to be adequate. So other scholars, philosophers included, have put together lists of what constitutes that which is religious. Well, it's going to have, some belief in God or gods. There's going to be some dichotomy between what is sacred and not sacred. There's going to be some rituals. There's going to be a priesthood. There's going to be a certain moral code, and then with that moral code, certain accountability that's tied to it. So I've seen lists as long as 16 of what counts as that which is religious. But probably for me, I think the best definition that I've ever come across is from Winfried Kodoran, a religious scholar who studied at Rice University, and he said this: religion is that which provides core values for us from which we derive means and goals, and it directs us beyond the mundane routine, everyday experience. So it directs us beyond the mundane routine. So, and that would include, both Eastern and Western religions, because you could be religious but not actually believe in a God. You could definitely believe in be an atheist and yet still embrace spirituality as well, right? And some type of code of religion that doesn't involve something that is transcended. It could be immanent, for that matter. I struggle with that, with trying to wrestle with what is religious and what's not. I don't find it to be all that helpful as I do looking at it from, let's say, from the perspective of Peter Berger and Luckman in their book, Social Construction of Reality, where we can look at religion as a human product. And it is something that we create and something that we give contours in practices and codification and so forth.
I just a quick follow-up to this, because I did take a look at your book just this weekend, and True Confessions.
From a Catholic.
That's right, but Kim already knows it, so she told me she's already read through this one, The Worship is Experience. And so one of the identifiers that you mentioned is that constitutes what is religion, a response to what is religion, is that it takes us beyond the mundane, right? And it seems to me, just following my quick, rough, albeit perhaps superficial examination of your argument, is that you're looking for something in the everydayness, in your aesthetic examination of these churches. How do they handle the everyday lives of the congregation, right? So how does the church handle this or that church handle, or this and that religion, Christian in this case, deal with the kind of everydayness of people's lives, and especially on an aesthetic level?
What is aesthetics? Right? What is aesthetic?
Well, this is usually, I mean, we both work in aesthetics, right? And we both work in ethics, but I think your embrace of aesthetics is a lot more up front and direct than mine is. So why don't you answer that?
Well, I just simply, aesthetics is the philosophy of beauty, and with it, it can also be integrated with the philosophy of art. So we consider the value of art, etc. And in particular, within the philosophy of beauty, my favorite area is what counts as an aesthetic experience.
Right.
And of course it was John Dewey's Art as Experience, published in 1934, I believe, that was so transformative in helping me understand the how to perceive, how to really perceive and actually relish in the live experience,
Mm-hmm.
and how to mine the riches of the extraordinary in the ordinary. And oftentimes, one of the things that I have discovered in my own life, and something that Dewey observed, is the fact that we go through our lives experiencing the grind, going through the routine, kind of a McDonaldized, processed life, and we miss the riches that are found in the now. And C.S. Lewis, in a meditation that he had, Meditation of a Tool Shed, he talks about how he walked into this tool shed to grab a tool, and there was a beam of light above the door, crack above the door, that was coming into this dark tool shed. And of course, C.S. Lewis is so great about, being arrested by the now. And he sees this beam of light, and instead of reaching for the tool that he was reaching for and then going about to do what he needed to do, he pauses and he stares at the light. And he sees the light illuminating the dust that he stirred up when he opened up the door to the tool shed. But he did something that I wish I would do more often, and that is engage that aesthetic sight, right? And have a rich experience right there in the ordinary. So what does he do? He stares at the light, he sees what's illuminated by the light, and then he steps into the light. And he looks up, and he follows the light through the crack, through the trees, to the ultimate source, of course, being the sun. And he said this: looking at the light and following the light are two distinct experiences.
Mm.
And so in the grind of daily living, being able to take in the aesthetics that are around us can give us rest, even if it's for a moment, provide healing, get our mind off of things that are difficult, right, etc. And with reference to the church in particular, when we walk out of a religious service, and it doesn't matter if it's a Christian service, it could be any other type of religious corporate gathering, and we walk out of that event whereby it was forgettable, there's just something amiss. If it's forgettable, or if it doesn't qualitatively nourish you, something has failed. And interestingly enough, oftentimes there are aesthetic barriers that keep us from experiencing any type of transcendence, for that matter, because it could be poor music, it could be a poor sermon, it could be things done in a very mechanical and mindless way. So there is no engagement of the heart, the mind. We're just going through the motions, like being processed, right, through an assembly line. And thus, the experience falls short of what it could have been. And that's also the same, not just in a mechanical, mindless way, which is an enemy to aesthetic experiences, but also being involved in a corporate worship setting that's chaotic, that's random. It too will fall short of what it could have been. It could be memorable, but in the words of Dr. John J. McDermott, it didn't feed your soul. It didn't nourish you. I think Dewey's insight there about these two enemies of aesthetic experience, pursuing any activity in a mechanical and mindless way, or pursuing any activity in a random, chaotic way, will keep the experience from being what it could have been. Mm-hmm. Right? And so that goes with studying. That goes with how we engage each other in conversation. That goes with what do we talk about? The person who's tending to the plants, mm-hmm. the person who's at the baseball game, the person who is, taking care of the lawn. How do we actually engage those types of experiences? So
I'm going to go off script and have an experience. No, but Paul, one of the things that, because I've known Paul for maybe not quite 20 years, but almost, it's been a while. And one of the things that I've always liked about you, and I've told you, is it seems easy for you to be grateful. And I met him at a time when I was not very grateful for the experience that we were sharing. And I always was amazed, like, how is this guy always so happy and grateful or positive, And I don't know how you did it, but I do think that you, of course, by your own lights, you probably could do more of that engagement, like C.S. Lewis does. Follow the light instead of just looking at it. But by you doing that, by you being having gratitude in your own life, it makes the people around you wonder, how is this guy doing it? How is this guy happy? How is this guy positive, with being in the dark in the cold tool shed and following the light? If nothing else, it made your experience aesthetic. But it also, I guess, just those around you who were looking at you, just sharing, going through life with you, memorable, just being with you. I mean, gosh, it's like we're going through the journey of life together, and you're grateful. So it's great to have you as a companion going through that part of our journey.
Let me gloss on this. So one of the things that you were talking about, if you go into a church and you go to a service, and if you don't come out and it's not memorable, there's something wrong, right? So what came up in my mind was, it's not inspiring. And if it's not inspiring, then there's no aspiration, right? I'm not going to aspire to do something differently or better, right? To make my material conditions or my aesthetic experience in life better. If I'm not inspired, if the experience itself, like an experience, a religious ritual experience, whatever, is deadening, mechanical, or whatever, there's no harmony, right? Because beauty's about harmony, right? And how things fit together nicely and just right, right? So no inspiration, no aspiration. I mean, you don't get to follow the light if you're not inspired by the light, right? And so, maybe if that tool shed was all cluttered, there was.
It's interesting because at
dirt
the
and
time,
cobwebs in the way.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, if you remember, I was probably an angry atheist. I was an angry atheist for many years, and just you were always so happy, and it didn't matter what came our way. You were positive, and we were going to get through it, and we did. And you had an aesthetic experience, and I was grumpy the whole time. I want to ask the next one. How did you come to study religion?
Oh, that's a great question. So I grew up in a very non-religious home. Not that my parents were against things of religion or against God, but it was irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a girl that lived 2 houses down from me, and she said to me one day, she said, "Paul, I did the weirdest thing last night." I said, "What did you do?" And she said, "I read my Bible." I said, "You what?" She said, "I read my Bible." I said, "Well, why'd you do that?" She said she was laying in bed and she looked up and saw the Bible sitting on the bookshelf and decided to open it up, and wherever it opened, that's what she was going to read. It opened to the book of Proverbs. And so she said, it's really incredible. I want to read this passage to you. Now, for the life of me, I can't remember what the passage is. But she read it to me. But before that, I resisted. I said, "Sherry, this ain't church. Put that Bible away." But she's so beautiful, she could just talk you into anything. And so she read the passage to me. I thought it was so awesome. I decided that I would go to the local mall, walk into the Walden bookstore, and buy the best Bible I could find. And I picked up what was called a Ryrie Study Bible. And it is a Bible that has footnotes at the bottom, a commentary to help you understand it. And I started reading with the book of Revelation first, because I heard that there was wars, end times, things like that. I thought, well, that has to be fascinating. So I started reading the book of Revelation, and that is where my journey began. And so after I graduated from high school, I went to Stephen F. Austin. Well, I went in the military as a U.S. Naval, into the U.S. Naval Reserve. So after I finished my boot camp and my corpsman training as a medic, I then went to Stephen F. Austin State University, in part because Sherry, who lived 2 houses down, also went to SFA. And I was told that if I wanted to go and study theology and study everything related to ministry, well, then I should major in philosophy, history, or English. And having a philosophical mind already, I wanted to pursue philosophy, but unfortunately, there's not many philosophers in East Texas, at least where I lived, and they didn't offer that as a major. So I majored in history, and I fell in love with it. The history department at SFA is extraordinary, and I fell in love with it. And then after that, I went on to Dallas Seminary, and I studied, I crammed 4 years into 8 studying mostly theology, and loved it. But while I was there was a professor, very, very famous American theologian named Dr. John F. Walvert, and he was president of Dallas Seminary from like 1952, I think, to 1986. And he told me that he could not answer certain theological questions without a philosophical background. He said, "Paul, you have a philosophical mind. You should go to a university and study philosophy for your Ph.D. So,
What constitutes a philosophical mind there, Paul?
I know, right?
That's the question that's shouting out.
No, it's probably asking a lot of questions
Yeah,
about the nature of something.
That's a very good response. Because that's one way to identify a philosopher is he or she who raises questions about the status quo or existing conditions.
They keep asking questions.
They just keep asking questions, right?
Yes, with an earnestness to know,
Right.
not to simply stir the pot,
Right.
so to speak, but to really know.
But to stir the pot too sometimes.
Oh yes, it happens.
What do you think? Well, we interrupted you, so then you went and...
So several years later, right, while I was at Dallas Seminary toward the end, I heard about the History of Ideas program at UT Dallas. So I went to UT Dallas and studied art and philosophy and Holocaust studies under an incredible Holocaust survivor. But while I was in the midst of doing that, I had an opportunity to interact with Dr. Alvin Plantinga. And at the time, I wanted to study epistemology. And he said that if I can't come to Notre Dame, that I should go to Texas A&M. And so while I was at Texas A&M, I met Professor Richard Stadelman, who is a professor of religious studies. And it was from him at A&M that I began to be introduced to religious studies in a formal way that was different than studying systematic theology from a theological institution.
What is epistemology?
A study of the ways that we know the world. And I want to come back to aesthetics, though, because aesthetics comes from the word aesthesis, which means that which, the ways, the word that's used to refer to how we're sensibly engaged in the world, right? That's just in the basic root of it. But similarly, epistemology is a studying of the way we know the world. So there is a connection ultimately between how we know the world and how we're sensibly engaged in the world. You know, when somebody like Kant would separate those two, you know, the intelligible world and the sensible world, and said the only way we can know the sensible world is to, you know, give ourselves these categories of understanding so we can know the world responsibly.
I always, the Muppet song always comes back in the back of my head, between noumena and phenomena. And then the mana always
comes up, right?
pops up in my head. Okay. And
yeah, because, well, no, that's a good point, because I mean, Kant took pride in saying he never stepped across the threshold of a brick and mortar church, but he nonetheless used the concept of God. So in his philosophy, for ethical reasons, and ultimately also for aesthetic reasons, for, you know, in his book on judgment, Critique of Judgment. So, but there's a difference between those people who study the concept of God and the concept of religion, and religion as that kind of constructed social phenomenon, and those who actually believe in practice, right? I think there's a really big difference between those two things. Anyway, that was going down a rabbit hole perhaps that we needn't follow, the Kantian one.
What would you say is the difference between religion and philosophy? They seem so close together.
They are. So this is my interpretation of it. You know, philosophy and theology are asking the same questions, right? And philosophy and theology were very much wedded until the Enlightenment, and where we began to see a divorce of those two. So we think about people, you know, like Augustine and Aquinas, Maimonides, for example. And so, so philosophy and theology to me were wedded until the modern age. But theology provides the answers. You know, what they believe are the answers to those questions, or religious, depending upon the type of world religion. And it seems that the more conservative you are, the more you're going to turn to, you know, religious texts that you believe to be authoritative. And that those religious texts then will provide the answers to those questions. You know, what is real, what is true, what is good, what is beautiful. And so you have those metaphysical underpinnings, you know, in philosophy, right, where it is somehow tied to God, but then when you get to, well, you can't know that there's a God, or you know, it's divorced from that, then these religious answers can become secularized. It's like you borrow from a religious worldview, you secularize it, and then you live it out as principles by which to live by. But you're not necessarily wrestling with the issue of whether or not God exists. You're not thinking about the nature of God, etc. And so I think philosophy and theology are answering or asking the same questions, but depending upon the spectrum, you have different world religions providing answers largely based upon texts. But of course, you have religious figures, authorities, traditions, etc., that contribute to those answers as well, apart from the text per se.
I'm going to stir the pot with a commentary, but I've run into people, colleagues, who claim not to be religious, but it could be about logic, or it could be about science, or it could be about atheism. Whatever it is, they hold those truths to be self-evident. And so in a way, the dogmatic aspect of that the religion can be dogmatic is the same, right? In politics or in science, whatever their interpretation of that ultimate truth that is unquestionable.
You and I have a lot in common,
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
I came to philosophy through religion as well, and I love history. I teach philosophy of history courses and work with history a lot. In fact, the book I just published I'm publishing this translation with my son, is Hegel's philosophy, Hegel and the State, which is his philosophy of history and his political philosophy kind of combined into one. But he takes on Christianity too. If you know much about Hegel, I mean, his whole first part of his life was emerged out of the time he spent at the training to be a Protestant theologian in Tübingen. So I have a little bit of a different take on theology and philosophy than what you espouse there. And I wrote my dissertation on this German Jewish philosopher named Franz Rosenzweig, and also Martin Heidegger, which is where I got the aesthesis stuff, right? But Rosenzweig's contention about theology and philosophy is that theology directs us towards subjective experiences, and philosophy towards objective experiences. So our systematic thinking sorts of stuff we get, and this has to do with epistemology too, right? From how we train ourselves in philosophy. But these kind of deep-seated beliefs and these meaningful connections we make as subjects are better dealt with something like theology or religious belief and practice. So that's his perspective. I'm actually inclined that way because he identifies the same things that you did. He said theology and philosophy have been, intertwined with each other a long time, until theology came into great disrepute in the modern period.
What is the difference between spirituality and religion?
That's a great question, and so we can think of spirituality as just a gigantic circle, and within spirituality you'll have a smaller circle, and that smaller circle will be religion. And so having already sort of discussed this kind of nebulous definition of what religion is, when we think about spirituality is concerned with meaningful connections. It's concerned with meaningful connections with yourself, removing the layers of onions of false identities to come to experience who you are. It could be meaningful connections with others, nature, of course, the cosmos, and even the arts. And so one can be spiritual, right? Not necessarily be tied to, a religious community. But interestingly enough, I think there is a false dichotomy that's created that one is either spiritual or religious. Mm-hmm. I mean, that can be the case for many. But there are also those people who are religious and spiritual. And I think of Thomas Merton, for example, as a great example, of one who is both religious and spiritual. He sees meaningful connections that transcend traditional boundaries, with reference to the church. But then you have those who are disenfranchised with the church, with religion. They have been hurt. They have been maligned. They have been abused in some way. They are hurting. When we think about how poisonous legalism can be, for example, like within Christianity. It can just take everything that's good out of you. And so, but people want to still be connected to God. They still believe in God. They believe in the different core values of the Christian faith, let's say, for example, but they are not going to step into church again.
Mm-hmm.
And so you also have the issue of people finding more meaningful experiences beyond the church walls, or beyond some type of religious community, where once again they go to a religious setting and it doesn't feed them, but they can find those spiritual connections tied to other aspects of life. Having gardening, as you are gardening, the experience of that is feeding you. And so, or jazz, or going, etc. So there can be these meaningful experiences that are by far greater than what is being offered in the church. So it may not be a being disenfranchised or somehow opposed to the church, but if I have just, let's say, Sunday available, how am I going to spend that day? Do I want to do something that will nourish me, or do something that will not nourish me, right? So when somebody says that I'm I'm not into religion, I'm spiritual, well, I want to ask, how did you come to that conclusion? And then questions like, well, what do you mean by religion? This is the philosopher of mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by religion? What do you mean by spirituality? And now I do believe that within the United States, and that the Eastern world faith traditions, have played a dynamic role and impacting what we think is spiritual, what we think is religious, etc. And so I believe, like for examples in Buddhism, etc., they have made an impact in society, and thus people are thinking about these things in different ways that they have not considered before. And they have actually found relief, in some of these things. Like, for example, the idea of just calming down,
mm-hmm.
and not being so preoccupied with busyness. To quit trying to create an identity that is not you. Trying to, being in the corporate world where you don't ever get the chance to engage nature, and so you have nature deficit disorder, right? Which is not a disorder per se, but it's the fact of, what are the repercussions when you're not engaged in the natural world?
It's a type of neurosis.
Yes. And then you go out in nature and you're like, wow. And once again, you see the extraordinary in the ordinary. And you have what John Dewey talks about, that live experience. That's transactional.
I think it's interesting. It's a need to be connected, to connect.
Mm-hmm.
And it may not be that community that we should fit into with the Sunday church, but through whatever experience that does feed our soul, we find that connection with something.
Well, I just want to explore the
Mm-hmm.
notion of what does it mean to feed your soul, or what does it mean to nourish or feed me, and how does religion do that? I mean, how is it feeding? What is it feeding in me? Is it feeding me, making me? Am I hungry for something, and therefore the religion satisfies that hunger for something, or is it some kind of, we need that nourishment on a daily basis, right? In a regular sort of way? Is that what you mean by feeding or nourishing?
Mm. Well, it's sort of like the type of food that you eat.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you could eat processed foods, right?
Yeah.
And it may, of course, you may eat those foods and may enjoy it, right? You may even develop an appetite for it. But and then when you're faced with an incredible meal that's fresh, organic, beneficial to you, more so, you still choose the processed foods over it.
Yeah.
And so experiences can be that way. That there are experiences that can be quite anemic, and experiences that extract things from you, right, in a way that is can take a toll on you. And so when I think about nourishment, I really do think about it in a kind of a nutritious way. And will this experience, will it enlighten my mind, right? Will it somehow contribute to virtue? Will it generate things that will contribute to intellectual and moral excellence? Will I be for the better, for it? I love Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia and the idea that I could flourish as a person. But I know that there are certain experiences that the humdrum, the monotony, the grind, that do not. They take things from you over time. And then there are certain people that come into your life or certain experiences that really work a number on you. And they extract a heavy price. And so when I think about these types of experiences, in a religious setting, for example, you have a community. And if that community is loving and caring, a place of belonging, you develop a corporate identity. I mean, one of the greatest struggles we have is loneliness.
Right.
And so to be part of a community vertically, and then to make meaningful connections with God, right? That in itself can be a very nourishing and meaningful experience, for that person. And so you have a vertical dimension and a horizontal dimension that can be quite nourishing, but and be very rich. And so, moreover, when you're divorced from community and you're cut away from, let's say, a community that you've come to know and care about, it can be like the moorings have been taken off have been let go from a ship, and you don't know where you're going. And that can be quite a period of uncertainty and fear. But then you can come and become part of a new community. And once again, Peter Berger and Luckman discuss about the process of alternation and how, for example, you leave one community and you enter into another community. And then how there's a transactional experience that occurs whereby you become shaped by that community as that community is being shaped by you, right, in terms of your contribution. And so when it comes to religions, I can look at it subjectively and say, in terms of a human product, right, that it can actually be a very meaningful experience or it can be a destructive experience, right? But depending upon the health of that particular community, it will say a lot about the experience that you'll take away from. And now, but going back to the religious community in itself, or religion is answering questions. They're giving you a set of answers. And if you find those answers satisfying, that settles things for you. And so then you can move on to other things, right? And of course, I believe that it's critically important that in order to be healthy, that we strive to develop interpersonal relationships. And those interpersonal relationships, where you're bound together by a certain set of ideas, can be very significant to you.
Yeah. There's dangers in that as well.
Sure.
Because fascism preaches the same thing, right?
Right.
I'm still bound together by those ideas, right? They're interpersonal, but they're based on subjecting other people to be forced into thinking the way I think, right? I think religious communities, at least healthy religious communities, act a bit differently. And
Right.
they have at the core healthy ethical values that are helpful for people and
Non-exclusive.
non-exclusive, and ones that are, that place a lot of value on people participating in the community in voluntary ways as well. They're not forced into the community, in other words.
Correct. And I agree with you. And I think that caveat, right, the little asterisk underline is healthy.
Right.
Right. And, but I love it when the horizontal and the vertical converge together.
Mm-hmm.
That can be really incredible experience.
Yeah.
In your opinion, do you think a person can be ethical without belief in God? I mean, you kind of
100%.
already said it, but I want to ask directly.
Sure, 100%. Absolutely.
How does that happen?
And so, well, I think, for example, Gertrude Elizabeth Margaret Anscombe in her 1958 article, right, where she said, look, if you want to be a moral person, you want to pursue morality, you should turn to Aristotle's virtue ethics, right? And but the question is not can you be good without God, but can there be a basis of objective morality apart from God? And of course, when we think about that question, we have that Euthyphro dilemma, right? That if something is good, it's because God wills it, or God wills it because it is good. But that might just be a false dichotomy, because there might be another way to look at it for those that embrace objective morality, and that God himself is good. And flowing from the nature of God, you can have a sound basis for objective, values, duties, and accountability. So, so one can be gloriously good. You know what I mean? I have met some amazing people who were not just merely, atheistic. They were anti-theistic, but yet they were people of moral virtue. And unfortunately, many people don't think, well, if you're not religious, well, then you can't be moral. But that's just not the case at all. It has to do with the objective basis of morality. Upon what objective basis can we ground morals, right? And so I think, Margaret Anscombe, once again, C.S. Lewis, after World War I, he came out as an atheist. He lost his mom at the age of 10. And he said that when he lost his mom, this is in his book, Surprised by Joy, it was like Atlantis sunk for him. Experienced a lot of brokenness and pain and isolation. But then after World War I, the trench warfare, he came out as an atheist. But then in 1929, he realized, how can I say something is unjust unless I have a standard of what is just? How can I say a line is crooked unless I have some idea of what a straight line looks like? And it was through the problem of evil and suffering that he realized that he was actually borrowing from the objective moral law argument. And consequently, through the problem of evil, he actually became a theist. But then J.R.R. Tolkien, just to kind of go on, don't mean to rabbit trail, J.R.R. Tolkien, when he told J.R.R. Tolkien this, Tolkien, who came out of World War I as well, as he was a committed Roman Catholic, he said, well, what kind of a theist are you, right? And that started C.S. Lewis into a whole new direction.
I want to...
Wait, just one
yes.
second.
Okay, sure.
Because we only have a few minutes left, actually. So I also studied this, I mentioned to you this German Jewish philosopher named Rosenzweig. He also came out of World War I. But was so disenchanted with the suffering and the degradation and the mass mobilization of mass killing, right? That he sought to develop a relationship between theology and philosophy where we could construct some kind of religious communal thinking that doesn't have to go through evil to get there. But that actually emphasizes, hearkening back to somebody like Augustine, that creation is good. Like, this is a good thing that we're in the middle of creation. And this leads him then to, emphasizing thanksgiving versus, this dichotomy between evil and good, and that you don't have to throw yourself in one way or the other. But that, in fact, we can work towards the good without having to be, deal with this being entrenched in evil, right? And by all accounts, World War I was pure evil.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Anyway, there's different ways to think about that relationship of how we think evil and good. And what do we do with that? Do we act from the evil in response or reaction to it, or do we act to develop these kinds of good alternatives? Something very abstract, but
I find that to be fascinating.
Yeah. Anyway.
My next question is, how do you manage, because I'm hoping to teach Intro to World Religion in the spring, so I'm going to learn a lot, which I'm looking forward to doing. Yes. Can you imagine me teaching world religions?
I can, and you'll do a fantastic job.
It'll be interesting.
I believe in the Aggie in you.
So how do you manage to teach religious studies to the diverse student body with a wide array of religious and secular worldviews?
That is so great. It's such a great question.
It is.
Okay, so let me see if I can answer this. For me, I use the existential.
Okay.
So that is universal. When we deal with the deep struggles of the human constitution, we think about identity and meaning and purpose and significance. So, I have counted at least 20 of these existential themes. And I craft that into the introduction into my lectures. But here's another thing. It's not merely pulling on the existential. So I'm not going to get up there and say, okay, this is what Taoism believes, and this is the founder of Taoism, da-da-da-da-da. I'm going to start out by saying, have you ever found yourself, right, struggling, but never achieving? And you ask yourself, what is wrong with me? Right, etc. I haven't found what I'm looking for, and everywhere I go, I'm facing this wall.
It looks
Should
like
I
I'm
just
swimming upstream?
Swimming upstream. Should I fight it? How do I keep going on? And I'm personal and vulnerable about it, right? But I will tell you somebody that has really impacted the way that I teach. Bell Hooks. Transgressive pedagogy. So I use the existential to hook my diverse students. I am vulnerable to create a meaningful connection. I am no better than they are. Maybe less than. But I'm going to seek to reach them where they are by being vulnerable and real and sharing my own struggles, but then I want to give them voice. So one of the ways that I give my students voice is that we are a part of this community together to share. But I also create projects for them to share their voice so that we can learn from each other. Because in that classroom of diversity is strength. There is strength in community. And they have a lot to offer and a lot of insights that I do not have. But they have something to contribute. And it is a sad thing when we're in a classroom where the professor's ego is all you get, but rather there's an opportunity to make a transformational impact, transformative impact. And I will also say this, we also have to recognize in the classroom that it's not only about religious diversity and gender diversity, etc. It's also about economic, social diversity. Because middle class and upper class students will actually engage you differently than working class students. First generation students, like me, right, had no idea about certain things, just didn't know. And so the way we approach a problem or answer or seek to answer a question is going to be different than somebody else. And so the classroom is, you have incredible capabilities among the students, but how they approach what you are saying, they do so through different lenses. And a lot of these have to do with social constructs, right? The way that they have been shaped. And so anyway, I want to reach them where they are in an effort to help guide them where they need to be. But that really demands that I listen to them and recognize who they are and be sensitive to the constructs that have shaped them in different ways.
I just have to say, I can tell by that rather lengthy answer of yours why you were awarded this Teacher Excellence Award, right? If you construct your classrooms like that, that's just like ideal. You know, giving the students voice, there's strength in the diversity. Those are all excellent virtues in pedagogy. So I congratulate you for that.
Well,
that's
you're
great.
very kind. Thank you.
No, that's wonderful.
And
I try to do that in my classes. I think both Kim and I both exercise that kind of sharing of vulnerability and connecting with our students as we can to provide them the common ground for learning.
We have like maybe one more minute. So there were still so many questions, but before I maybe ask one more, any questions you might have for us, Paul?
Well, when it comes to religion, how do you see its contribution, in academia today? The role of religious studies in academia.
Yeah, it's a great place to learn. I mean, much I think like ethics, to learn tolerance, and not just tolerance, but appreciate other perspectives. Mm-hmm. Which, to learn tolerance if that's what we need to learn. Mm-hmm. But which sometimes that may be where we're at. But if you're already tolerant, then and you're curious, just keep learning, keep learning from others. Mm-hmm. That we don't have all the answers, so let's see how other people are going at it.
Well, historically, religions have been, the various religions throughout the world have provided vehicles for, as you mentioned at the beginning, forming these kinds of important communities that nourish each other, right? But that also help us deal with suffering and exile and personal pains.
The daily grind.
Individual pains. We're just the daily grind, but traumatic experiences as well. And so you can experience in a community like that forms of liberation, freedom, right? And providing it's inspirational and aspirational.
Right, exactly.
Aesthetic.
Coming back to that aesthetic point, right?
That's so good. Yes.
So thank you for having us, Paul.
Well, thank you for having me. It's such an honor.
Yeah, well, to our crew, thank you, and our guests. And this has been Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera. Dr. Paul Shockley, Kim Diaz.
Joel Simon.
Please join us next time.